Perhaps one thing to mention, which I think is really relevant in the COVID context, is that there are such significant individual differences in how people cope with challenges. And it's good to keep in mind that some of us, we show our sort of stress and anxieties straight away, but for others, they might experience more of the worry and concern later on. So from a leadership perspective, it's really important to appreciate and understand these individual differences so that you can tailor your response to what the employee needs might be.
Tervetuloa kuuntelemaan Filosofian Akatemian podcastia. Keskustelemme työelämän murroksesta ja sen uusimmista ilmiöistä ja kutsumme sinut mukaan vallankumoukseen inhimillisemmän työelämän puolesta. Tämä on tiede, rakkaus, vallankumous.
Hei, olen Minna Janhonen. Mun podcasteissa keskustellaan resilienssiin ja sen kehittämiseen liittyvistä teemoista, erityisesti työelämän näkökulmasta. Yhdessä vieraatteni kanssa sukellamme muutoskyvykkyyden yksilöllisiin piirteisiin ja liidämme lintuperspektiiviin katsomaan maailman myllerrystä ja sen vaikutuksia meihin ja työhömme sieltä käsin. Olet sydämellisesti tervetullut mukaan. In this special episode, we talk about organizational resilience and especially what organization has to take account when it wants to develop its resilience. I have pleasure to talk about this subject with Associate Professor, Resilience Researcher Sanna Malinen from University of Canterbury, which is situated in Christchurch, New Zealand. Warmly welcome, Sanna.
Thank you.
Sanna, could you first tell us a little bit about yourself? You are originally from Helsinki. How did you end up as a resilience researcher in New Zealand?
Well, I went to study to New Zealand in 1996 and just fell in love with the country. It's beautiful nature and friendly people. And I ended up studying organizational psychology. And while I'd probably describe myself as an organizational behavior or development researcher, the context in which I live in, so that means various natural hazards in New Zealand, led me to engage in research on employee and organizational resilience. And I was also really lucky to collaborate with some wonderful researchers in New Zealand and here, with such as people like yourself, on various resilience-related projects.
Sanna, can you describe a bit what is resilience and why resilience research is topical in New Zealand?
Well, there's various waves of looking at resilience, but the way we've looked at it, we consider it as employees or organizations' ability to survive or even thrive in the face of uncertainty, in the face of adversity. And it really includes this idea of rapid adaptation under adverse conditions. And I'm sure you agree resilience is topical globally, but I guess New Zealand faces challenges with various disasters, natural hazards really, including volcanic eruptions. We've had frequent floods, lots recently actually, and of course earthquakes. So resilience is certainly topical, both from a community but also workplace perspective. But I said, being adaptive, whether as a person or as an organization, it's really critical in today's workplace where we're all faced with challenges of various degrees. So being resilient is important in crisis situations, but also in everyday work.
Yes, I totally agree that we need resilience in many different situations. For example, now that we have had this COVID going on for a couple of years, but let's talk about it a bit later. But about the earthquakes, in 2011 there were a series of earthquakes in Christchurch area where you live, and one of them was very destructive. It destroyed most of the Christchurch business centre. Is it that true? And from the organizational resilience research point of view, you got interesting and important data. What did you learn about organizational resilience from these series of earthquakes?
Yeah, so I guess it's good to mention that while there was sort of a significant earthquake in 2011, the aftershocks continued for a number of years. So we literally had thousands of quakes after the fatal 2011 quake. So organizations, people's and communities' resilience was really tested over quite a long period of time. I was part of a multidisciplinary team that was led by my colleagues Bernard Walker and Ven Nilekand. And we investigated why some organizations, they were able to cope and adapt so much better during the crisis, which, as I said, it continued for a long time, a bit like this current pandemic. And the team found that particularly 4 capabilities were important and were key to organizations' resilience or their ability to adapt. And I might just mention those 4 capabilities briefly. The first one was being people-focused or having a people-centric culture. So basically putting your people before profits. The second was the ability to collaborate. And that was both internal within an organization, but also external to organizations. And so the relationships were really key in managing in the midst and post-crisis. The third was the ability to learn, and really importantly, being able to use those learnings. And of course, finally, leadership, which is really important for the development of these other factors. But I often work at the individual employee level. So with 2 other organizational psychology researchers, Katarina Näswall and Joanna Kunz, and some brilliant postgraduate students, we also explored what contributed to those cultures which were people-centric, and particularly on employees' resilience, and certain factors which were really similar at the organizational and individual level, like having supportive leadership, for example, were really highlighted. Perhaps one thing to mention, which I think is really relevant in the COVID context, is that there are such significant individual differences in how people cope with challenges. And it's good to keep in mind that some of us, we show our sort of stress and anxieties straight away, but for others, they might experience more of the worry and concern later on. So from a leadership perspective, it's really important to appreciate and understand these individual differences so that you can tailor your response to what the employee needs might be.
You mentioned that leadership is one of the key factors when you want to be resilient, both from the organizational and individual perspective. What is the most important thing for a leader or manager to remember if he or she wants to enhance organizational resilience or individual resilience?
I think one of the important things is really to focus on developing that people-centric culture. And that means employees feel like they're being heard, they feel like they're being cared for, and showing empathy towards your people is important. And empathy comes through in lots of different research in terms of what makes successful leaders. I guess it sort of works through social exchange, or at least partly, so that if you look after your people, they are more likely to reciprocate with commitment, with engagement. And when people feel well, when their well-being is being looked after, then they are also likely to be better contributors, so that it really makes sense to look after your people. If I can just add, Minna, I'd also suggest that looking after your leaders is a critical factor. Leaders can be so good at looking out for their staff, but they're often overwhelmed. They can be exhausted, putting their team's well-being before their own. So good to think about who's looking after your leaders. When do they have time to recover?
Yes, so it's more an issue of everybody's well-being at the work or workability, how everybody can survive together, perhaps, from the different kind of adversities. So if you think about the work communities or communal perspective, what should work communities like teams or departments, should they perhaps handle the situation afterwards? After that something has happened, did you learn something about that in your research?
Perhaps I can comment from a learning perspective. So I guess it is an opportunity, and there's always these opportunities to look back and think about what went really well, and then what are things that we could perhaps do a little bit differently in the future. And perhaps it shouldn't be just a discussion. Discussion is really important for us, of course, but also that those lessons should be documented, and we should have discussions in terms of how do we actually utilize those lessons to make sure that we cope better in the future.
Mm-hmm. Then a bit about this COVID situation that we have had for a couple of years here. Do you think that these previous experiences about how to handle crisis situations in New Zealand, have they helped to handle COVID situation? Because it seems from us, what we have heard from the news, for example, how New Zealand has survived, it seems that you have survived very well, that you quite quickly did a bit stronger kind of actions to prevent the virus to spread over your country. And only 700 people has died in New Zealand, and here in Finland it's about 4,000. So it seems that it was before Omicron came, you survived pretty well, but now the Omicron has spread into your country. But what do you think? What was the key for the success in the early phases of COVID crisis?
Gosh, it's a pretty tough question to answer. I don't know of any evidence, I guess, that would support that some past disaster experience would have enabled New Zealand to cope better. And thinking about it, the role of past disaster experience on kind of future preparedness is not straightforward. One would think that we always learn from our experience, but I guess we don't always do that. But perhaps I could comment on a couple of things, thinking about the similarities between the earthquake response and the COVID response. Thinking about the question from an individual perspective, we certainly have some anecdotal evidence to suggest that employees, for example, in Christchurch, that was the area where the earthquakes happened, they were already used to disrupted work situations or working from home because many people's offices were out of action for quite a long time after the earthquake. So perhaps people were more adaptable during the pandemic to some of these changes or change in circumstances because of their past disaster experience. And perhaps we can draw some similarities between effective organisational responses and the New Zealand government's response in terms of resilience. So you mentioned quick decisions. That was certainly true, particularly to do with border closures. And that's perhaps now why we see those lower fatalities in New Zealand. And I think we can also see some other leadership factors that we have in common looking at the earthquake response and now the pandemic response. And that would include things like leaders showing empathy and being caring. For example, New Zealand's government prioritised people's health over economic concerns. And similarly, in the context of the quakes, we saw some evidence that those organisations with people-centric culture, so basically those that put their people first, seem to adapt and cope better. Another aspect was learning. New Zealand was in quite a fortunate position to be able to learn from other countries and their COVID responses, and then being able to adapt using that knowledge. I think New Zealand government also created real national unity. The Prime Minister always called us the team of 5 million and urging everyone to look after and to care for each other. And of course, the government did communicate frequently and really effectively. And all of these factors, being decisive, quick decision-making, showing empathy, learning, effective communication, they're important both in an emergency response like, post-quakes and in the COVID response. And they can certainly be all linked to factors that we see in resilience or in resilient organizations.
Yes. Did people in New Zealand, did they question these actions that your Prime Minister first announced, like very strict lockdowns?
Yeah, of course, people questioned, certainly. But I think the communication, at least from a personal perspective, was pretty effective, to look out for each other. And this was seen, so those strict lockdowns were seen as a way through which we could eliminate the virus, which New Zealand did do a couple of times. So I think even though it wasn't easy and people were, questioning those decisions, the compliance was pretty high. I think there's a high trust towards the government, and that certainly helped.
Yes, it was very nice that you mentioned that you call yourself like a team of 5 million people. It's kind of a big community and a big task for people to do this kind of handle adverse situations together. So I think perhaps you have a very strong team spirit. And does it come perhaps from your previous experiences how to handle crises?
There's certainly research that suggests that those social relationships and social capital is absolutely key when it comes to disaster response. There's some interesting research from contexts such as Hurricane Katrina that would suggest that actually social capital is the real reason why people cope and survive. So certainly feeling that you're all part of the same team and being cohesive and that idea that other people's well-being is also your responsibility. It's a shared responsibility. That's pretty empowering.
Yes. What about the situation right now in New Zealand? Are you already returning back to office work, like more like back to normal or new normal?
Yeah, I think it is getting there. We are working more from the office, but I think people have also found the benefits of working from home. And I'm sure you're going through similar discussions here in Finland where we're trying to find a balance of being in the office as well as working sometimes at home. And of course, there's these differences between industries in terms of how difficult or easy it is to do some of our work from home.
Mm. Yes, we have these similar discussions going on right now here. So how should we do this new kind of hybrid work together? How much remote work can we do? In what kind of work can be done at your home? And where do you need more community? Where you do need to see each other and discuss about topics like this? And there are lots of discussion around the hybrid work like right now.
There's so many factors to consider, aren't there? Even just the time that you spend commuting, that you can use that time differently. But also, making sure that your team stays cohesive and committed. That can be pretty tough to do just through those kinds of teleconferencing facilities like Zoom and Teams and so on. So I personally, for my work at least, it's wonderful to be able to do this, for example, face-to-face instead of through video conferencing.
Yes. Then the last question, actually, about the organizational resilience research in New Zealand. Are the results applicable to Finland or in other countries too?
I think so. Context and culture, of course, plays a part, but there's so much research that has accumulated over decades, and not just in crisis context, that would highlight these factors that we talked about: leadership, looking after your people, collaboration and learning as key to organizational success. But Minna, you living here in Finland, what do you think?
I think many of the items are applicable to Finland too, especially just like the leadership issues, empathetic leadership, cooperational issues, social capital issues also here in Finland. So many of them are, of course. And of course, the crisis readiness too. So how to rehearse for the future crisis, for example, that is also important in every country, of course. Yeah. And I think that we have learned a lot during this pandemic, how to be more resilient, because the situation has changed many times, like a new waves of viruses has came, and we have to learn over and over again how to handle this kind of new situations.
Absolutely. That brings it back to that idea of learning, that it's it's really about utilizing those lessons, right? What can we do differently next time? But Minna, you made a really good point about that idea of kind of inherent resilience. So a lot of the discussion that we've had has to do with this kind of adaptive capacity. So what happens when there is a crisis or has been a crisis? But you're quite right that organizations need to prepare for future crises as well. And that's really to do with that, as I said, inherent resilience. So things like testing your emergency plans and coming up with different scenarios to practice those, that's really important.
Yes, and doing the stress tests also to test your system. How does it work now? Do you have enough capacity to handle this kind of difficult situations?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you want to add something, Sanna? Is there something that you want to say still about resilience issues?
I guess the only thing that comes to mind is that organizations, workplaces, can do so much to develop, not obviously just the organization's resilience, but individuals' resilience. So it's not just up to us as individuals to think about how do we adapt better or how do we cope with more stress or higher demands, but actually through leadership and other organizational processes, you can actually make people more resilient, make them feel better. And I think that puts a lot of responsibility on organizations to look after their people.
Thank you, Sanna.
Pleasure.
Tämä oli Filosofian Akatemian Tiede, rakkaus, vallankumous podcast. Kiinnostuitko inhimillisen työelämän vallankumouksesta? Tilaa podcast haluamallasi podcast-alustalla ja kuuntele lisää jaksoja sekä tutustu blogiimme osoitteessa filosofianakatemia.fi.